Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another Lessons from Learning Leaders. I'm Dwayne Lester, continuing the legacy of our good friend and mentor, the trainer's trainer, Bob Pike. And I tell you, I was going through the, there it is, uh, still figuring out the live stream part of this, but we're getting there. Looks like we are at this time live on YouTube, we're live on Facebook, and we're live on Twitter. So that's exciting. Still trying to figure out why LinkedIn won't go live for me. And maybe we'll get it another day, maybe next time. But I was looking through the brochure for the upcoming training magazine conference and expo, and I saw one titled Learning Myths and Misperceptions and How to Crush Them. And I said to myself, I have to talk to this instructor. So I reached out, and Regan Patrick, Dr. Patrick, was kind enough to come on the show. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with me today and helping us all better understand these learning myths and misperceptions.
Thank you very much for the invite, Dwayne. It's an honor to be here, and very happy to talk about this topic specifically and learning and training overall, which is certainly both a personal and a professional passion of mine. So this is a really great opportunity. Thanks for the invite.
No worries. So before we actually get into that, tell me about yourself. How did you get where you are today? What's your story?
So my story, I began my career in the U.S. Air Force, 26 years as an officer and a pilot. And my learning journey, let's say, really began in earnest when I attended pilot training several years ago. I went to Air Force pilot training, eager, excited, motivated, a lifelong goal I was ready to fulfill, and I was super excited about being there. Over the course of about 6 to 8 months, through most of the pilot training initiative, I did not succeed as well as I had hoped, for sure. I mean, I earned my wings, yeah, but I graduated very low in my class, and I was demoralized and really angry with the fact that I didn't achieve many of the things that I wanted to achieve, and I really felt like I had not done well. So I asked myself critically, how does someone who shows up for a training program, motivated, inspired, and hungry to learn, leave, almost broken and really frustrated? It took many years to kind of work through that frustration, but I decided to really look into that. Was it my fault, something I did or was not capable of doing? Was it the training program itself bad? Were my instructors bad? There's a number of things that I really spent a lot of time thinking about, and it became sort of a journey. Several years later, when I was a training squadron commander in the U.S. Air Force, I had an opportunity to work with one of our contractors to start asking questions. Is our training as good as it should be? Where are we not achieving our goals? Why are we not achieving our goals if we're not? As we introduce new training technology, are we using it in the smartest way possible? How do you know? These types of really high-level questions really sort of occupied a lot of my time as a commander. So that inspired me to pursue an academic level of rigor. I went to graduate school at the University of Southern California, go SC. And through that process, I really began to understand the concept of lifelong learning. And really, I've tried to become a practitioner of that myself and inspire that in others, and sort of integrate that in a lot of training solutions in my professional life, working with CAE in the defense contracting space. The notion that learning never stops, and when it does, you're in serious trouble because the world's not stopping, and you need to keep up with it. So that's sort of a look at a lifelong learning journey, and certainly I've learned a lot along the way and continue to do so. And it's really, as I said, a personal and professional passion with me that I want to understand training and learning at all levels and become really good at what we do.
So there's a couple things you said that I'm really curious about. I'm curious what that contractor told you, because having been in the military, I've sat through a lot of those trainings. I remember the one thing I remember from a lot of my trainings is being told to go stand up in the back of the room because you're falling asleep. And I'm curious what the contractor told you about the Air Force's trainings. And I'm also curious if you could explain to me more about what you mean when you say lifelong learning.
Yeah, so Like all great mentor relationships, right? When I would ask a question, something that was vexing me, like, are we using this new technology in the best way possible? He would answer with a question like, well, what do you think? What is your vision of success? What would be an optimal use of this in your, from your perspective, based on your experience and your needs? So that inspired a lengthy conversation, which was often frustrating for me, honestly, because what I wanted was just an easy button. Do this and great things will happen. And that's never the case in learning, right? It's all very contextual. It is all subjective in some cases, and it requires a great deal of thought to create great training design and to make something that's meaningful to students, that helps you as a training provider achieve your objectives, that achieves the requirements that you're setting out for yourself. Rather than just providing me with a bunch of answers, right, he helped me learn and grow and ask more questions and really get kind of a curious nature and inspire kind of a curious nature on my part, which I really appreciate. He's a great friend and mentor to this day. So I'm very passionate about creating inquisitive minds, right? And that's a really important part of training design, I think, no matter what skill or behavior you're trying to teach. And this pairs well into the notion of lifelong learning, the idea that you can learn a particular discipline or skill, you can get very good at it, but you can never stop. You can never just say, I know everything there is to know about this, and then sit back and bask in your glory, so to speak. You really have to be active and engaged in whatever discipline you're dealing with. I can tell you in the aviation world where I work a lot, technology is constantly changing. Rules are constantly being updated. The environment we are working in the aviation training space is constantly shifting and moving. And we have to shift and move with it as instructors. And I believe that would be true of all disciplines. So we need to inspire in our students this notion that you are never complete in your learning journey. There's always something new for you to learn, skills to refresh, knowledge to be gained that is new or changed since you last learned it. And you have to integrate that mindset into your students as you train and educate them. It's not simply, just knowledge passing as we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that as soon as you started asking your mentor this question or these questions, rather than just giving you answers, he immediately started training you. He started training you, which is fantastic. It reminds me of some of the things that Bob Pike used to tell me. And one of the things I try to reemphasize to people as often as possible is people won't argue with their own data. So he could have sat there and said, you need to do this. This is awful. This is where you fix it. But instead he said, well, you go and look and you discover the stuff because you'd own it then. And it would mean more to you because you're like coming back. Look what I discovered. Look at this great thing. And because you discover it, it has more credibility. It means more. You're more likely to remember it. So these are all techniques that even in a one-on-one, he's immediately going to the trainer role, not the just telling, because telling ain't training, like we said earlier. And I love the idea of lifelong learning, because as soon as you stop, you're behind. The competition never stops, and frankly, the innovations never stop. And I'm curious. I'm going to go off on another book that I didn't even expect to bring up, but we started talking about the fact that no one learner is exact as another learner. And we brought up your Air Force, service. There's a great book out there by a guy named Todd Rose. It's called The End of Average. Have you ever heard of this book?
Not yet, but it's on my list now.
So Todd tells a story at the beginning of the book about how the Air Force at one point was struggling with the fact that they had great pilots and they had great machines, but they kept crashing planes. And they couldn't figure out why. And I won't go into the whole story, but what they discovered was they had built the cockpit for the average pilot. So they took measurements of everything: arm length, waist, head, everything they could, height, weight. And they built out of this an average. And what they went back and found is there wasn't one pilot that fit that average, not one of them. So the reason they were having so much trouble is because they built a one size fits all situation that wasn't serving anyone. And that, I think, relates very much to what we're talking about in training, where we have to be able to recognize who's in the classroom and how can we reach them.
Yeah, I certainly agree that the notion of what I often refer to as the production mindset in education, which is I'm just looking for maximum efficiency to pump as many students through in a given day as possible, or a year, whatever your metric is. It's really an antiquated learning model. And I think in academia, industry, a number of professions and pursuits, we're seeing that approach is changing. And education providers around the world are realizing that they need to be more responsive to the needs of their student, not necessarily the needs of their syllabus or the needs of whatever requirement they set out for themselves. It's important that we consider students are a key part of the process, and that's going to require breaking some very long-held paradigms and assumptions and beliefs, and to design for outcome as opposed to design for efficiency is a significant challenge in the education space. I'm finding, particularly in the defense training space where I live, a lot of folks are aware, but struggling to understand what that really is going to look like.
Let's get to these learning myths and misperceptions that you're talking about, because you can go back and look at all the different things. I was looking at something today that was talking about, what was it? Multiple intelligences and learning styles, the visual learn, and there's just so much out there. And like you said, every day something new comes out. So when you talk about learning myths and misperceptions, what are you actually talking about here?
I'll give you some background on this because this is what really inspired this talk. When I was in graduate school, I read an article for a paper that talked about something I had always just assumed as a course of truth with respect to learning design. And this article said that, nope, this is a myth. It's not really true. It's not supported by data. And I said, hold on a minute. I've grown up with this assumption that this is true. Never questioned it before. So I did some research on my own, and sure enough, that was a myth. That was a myth that had been pervasive, that I had grown up with, and it just impacted a lot of what I did as a training provider in the Air Force, particularly in the flying business. So that inspired me to say, well, if that's a myth, what other myths, misperceptions, or misconceptions are there out there that I should be aware of? And I've read several books, and I have perused the internet and gone to many different journals and periodicals to do research on this. And I'm surprised at some of the things that are out there that are widely held as sort of educational truths or foundations that people will operate from that are just simply not backed up by science or by research. And these things oftentimes are innocuous or not particularly important. They're just sort of, nice to know. But in some cases, they are extremely important in creating appropriate instructional design, or in how we deliver training, or what we expect our students to do or know. We should be aware of a lot of these myths, I think, as training providers, as educators, as professionals in the education business. And not only know that they are myths, let's say, but also know how to combat them, how to re-educate, and how to inform people of the actual truth to help improve and sharpen their educational practice. That's the genesis of the paper.
Was there one that really, you talk about how that initial discovery of it being a myth, is that the one that sticks out the most in your mind, or is there one that when you learned it was a myth, you were the most surprised by?
That's the one that sticks out the most. It's not the one that most surprised me, though. It really sticks out because it just introduced me to the notion that there are things that we may hold as sacred cows or unassailable truths that are not, or that deserve more investigation or inspection before we start, propagating the myth. But there are other ones in here that have really sort of really altered or impacted the way that I approach training and education, from a more data-informed or more critical analysis perspective, let's say. I'm less inclined to just accept stuff.
we all should be, especially in this day and age. We should all be a little more, we should be curious about what we're learning and where it comes from. Is there, I don't expect you, we don't have time for you to go through the entire program, but could you give us a few examples of some of these learning myths and how you'd go about crushing them?
Yeah. So, would you like me to describe some of these myths, or okay, sure. All right. So let's start off with what I consider the biggest elephant in the room, and that is the notion of learning styles. That individuals have preferred styles of learning that instructional designers and teachers and mentors need to be aware of, so that they can adjust their approach to an individual student. And one of the areas of concern for me in my space professionally is the fact that that myth is not only propagated, but is written out in the FAA Instructor's Handbook to teach future instructor pilots how to be better instructors. It is not supported by science. In fact, there's a growing body of research evidence out there that says that adjusting your educational approach to an individual's preferred learning style can have negative impact. It can result in bad outcomes that we don't want. It's not supported by science, and there are a number of alternatives you should be considering if you're worried about teaching to individual needs, let's say. So this is a really interesting particular myth I like to spend some time thinking about, because we want to get better at our ability to teach someone, or to provide information to our students in a way that matters to them. But at the same time, we don't want to be participating in something that might potentially detract from their learning experience. And if you're building a curriculum tailored to a learning style that's not supported by what students actually need, then you can really waste a lot of time and end up with some bad outcomes here. So as we examine individual learning myths, we have to have an eye towards how we address this myth and then how we overcome it. And that has a lot to do with change management and with the notion of knowledge and education and training as well, for practitioners, administrators, educators overall. So, of course, the first step is obviously educating, teaching someone that, hey, this is actually not true, first of all, and it's not backed by science. So let me share some sites with you, some information with you that might help you gain a different perspective on learning styles, let's say. And then let's talk, that's awareness. And then the second part of it, the second part of the solution is coming up with strategies to approach it. So I see that we want to create more individualized instruction in this case. So let's find some tools that are actually grounded in learning science, in neuroscience, cognitive science, behavioral science, whatever, that's supported by the research and the literature. And then let's try that out instead. So the idea is not crush people, but crush problems, let's say.
When you bring this to people's attention, I'm assuming that you face some pushback on this. That,
oh yeah,
a lot of times when you start confronting people with the fact that they're holding flawed information, rather than saying, "Oh, well, thank you so much for bringing that to my attention," it's, "I don't think you know what you're talking about. We've always done it this way." So how do you handle that when someone just clearly doesn't accept what you have to say?
Yeah, so I think that's, from my perspective, that's grounded in intuition. If something intuitively makes sense, then we're more apt to accept it as a truth, right? So if I believe that, in this case, learning styles just make sense, I see myself as a visual learner, therefore visual learning must be a real thing. It's much harder to kind of crack into that by just laying out, here's the actual research truth. I mean, all you have to do is look around the United States today. People are not always inclined to follow what science is telling them, and they believe, that there's nuance there. So, the idea is not to crush someone over top of the head that this is what science says and this is fact and you're wrong, because you'll meet all types of resistance in that case. So that's not going to crush anything. It's certainly not going to crush a problem. I've found, and what we'll be talking about in our discussion here in February, is that you certainly need to be aware of strategies to help people overcome biases, let's say, in this case, or resistance to an alternative viewpoint, and then get them to accept that there may be approaches that might be more effective. And those approaches would probably be grounded in science and literature and research, supported by fact and application. So it's also important to not use this situation to introduce some radical new idea, which may or may not be proved. We want to stick to what's known, and there's a huge body of literature and research out there about learning science that we can apply to improving outcomes that are, useful in dispelling these myths.
So I've looked into learning styles because it wasn't that long ago that I probably read some of the same things that you were reading about this being a myth. And I seem to remember reading somewhere that it was there are no learning styles, but people have learning preferences. Like I may prefer to learn visually, but that doesn't mean I can't learn if it's a podcast. Is that what you found?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are certainly preferences, and science is definitely helping us understand that to a greater extent. And we can, there are certainly people that are, let's say, mathematically inclined that just pick up math concepts faster than others. There are people that are more artistically inclined in their outlook and perspectives. But, do I need to tailor training and education specifically to a learning style? The answer is no. As you mentioned, we can learn in different ways. It's very content focused, and we need to be respectful of certainly people's preferences in terms of how they see the world. But learning is a different subject completely there.
That's going to be one that I think people are going to have a hard time accepting, because it's just been around for so long.
Yeah. It is absolutely, and I think as a part of my discussion in February is we're gonna discuss the science, what the science says, what the research has shown, and then talk about the differences between the two. Why one would be seen as a myth, and one and how we might approach changing that myth or changing perspectives on that myth based on what we know about human learning. It is very intuitive, as I said, that we believe that, hey, I'm a visual learner. I learn things visually. But that excludes the notion that you learn things through hearing, through sensing, through all of your other senses as well. And it's really very contextual. So we'll talk specifically in detail about this one. It's the number one myth that I confront.
Excellent. And I'm sure there's more. Like you said, we don't have time. How long do you have to present there? Is it like an hour?
An hour, yes. So I'm imagining 50 minutes, 10 minutes Q&A at the end, but I'll adjust and stick around as long as anybody would like to talk about it.
Have you presented there before?
No, first time at this conference.
Well, I'm sure this might not be something this isn't something we talked about, but I know that there are folks who go to these things and say, I'd love to present here myself. I know this because I'm one of them. So would you mind telling a little bit about the process that you go through in developing something like this and then getting it, basically selling it to the training conference so they'll take it?
Absolutely. So I speak and write a lot in the defense training space, particularly at a number of conferences. So I've been to the training conference several times, and I have had this topic in a separate forum. I've discussed it, and I said, I wonder if this would be a topic of interest to the training audience, training conference and expo. So I went online to the speakers section on their online thing, and it gave some excellent shaping guidance on topics. If you have a topic you think you want to present, here are some things to consider. Audience appeal, level of detail and scope, those types of things. And this topic in particular, I think, is relevant to educators in any domain, anywhere. The notion that if we want to get better at training, we better be aware of some pervasive learning myths and misperceptions, and then find out ways to combat them so that we don't fall victim to them in our training design. So thinking that this was a topic of universal interest, potentially, I wrote up an abstract to it and sent it in. And it was one of 3 topics I had sent in for this particular conference. Orlando is really nice in February. It's a little warmer than it is here in the DC area. So I was very happy to get accepted on this one and to develop it a little further. I would, for those folks that are interested in submitting to this conference or any other conference, I would highly encourage them to find mentors or folks that have experience in giving these conferences and really use them like a bird dog, someone that you can share your idea back and forth, and they can give you some recommendations or observations that you can consider to really fine tune your message for the audience. Now, this audience at Training 24, although it is heavily L&D, learning and development focused, there are a number of training practitioners and educators that attend this thing that I believe give it a really great sort of a cross-domain perspective. And I think this is a good opportunity to have these kinds of discussions.
So this would be learning myths and misperceptions and how to crush them. It's in the workbook. It's in the brochure. Go to the training conference, and I will go to it. I intend to be there. I look forward to learning the rest of them and how to crush them. Because if we are still operating under flawed, old mental models, then we are not doing what we need to ultimately do, and that's adding value and making a difference. We are not being as effective as we possibly can be, and that's just negligent, especially when it's out there and we can find it. We need to be doing as best as we can, especially when we're talking about aviation, when we're talking about the defense industry. And not to say that the other industries are not important. I'm not saying that at all. But when there are opportunities for us to learn and grow, we absolutely should take them.
Agreed. Yes, sir.
So what day, is this day one that you'll be?
Yes.
Okay.
Monday at 2:30, I think, is the breakout time.
Well, let me ask you one more question before we go. We just have a few more minutes left, and this is something that I like to find out from people. What are you reading right now?
The book that is on my table right now is Grit by Angela Duckworth.
Great book. I think I have that one. I think I know I have that one somewhere, because I remember I get a lot of my books. I travel a lot, and people have different things they do when they're on the road. I tend to go to thrift stores and look at their book section. And I found Grit at a book. I was like, what is this doing in here? How could someone just give this book away? I'm taking this. I have a friend who says he's like, he feels like he's rescuing them. You need to come home with me. I'll give you a nice space. And so that's how I felt with Grit. How is it? What's your biggest takeaway so far from it?
As an educator, we need to find ways to fully integrate resilience and self-efficacy training in all of our courses, particularly in my courses in the defense industry as well. I don't often see formal courses or syllabus items that include resilience, determination, self-reliance. These are implied skills that we want people to have. And I love Angela Duckworth's perspective that it needs to be a much bigger part of our lives if we're going to be successful in adversity.
I'm going to read it. Okay. Now you talked me into it. I was actually reading Boring to Bravo, but I'm rereading that one. I will go back and read this one. So we're looking at Monday, February 26th. Looks like it's 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Room 211, Learning Myths and Misperceptions, How to Crush Them. Regan Patrick, Chief Learning Officer, CAE. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. I want to thank you for sharing this and for putting this together, because there are still people out there who say, well, people have different learning styles, when that's been crushed, when that science has been shown to be wrong for so many years. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being a part of the program. And for everybody who's listening and watching, I want to charge you once again. One thing that Bob Pike used to always close his podcast with was his encouragement for everyone listening to go out, add value, and make a difference. And I encourage you to do the same. Thanks for listening.